Andy, you can be turning to the book of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes. We'll let you take a moment and try to find that here. We're thankful that you're here tonight. Thankful to see Brother Mark with us over here. We were talking just a moment ago. I know this is not the full congregation, but he was reminded me. He came in to get some of the display materials for Good News Today, take up to polishing the pulpit, which starts technically tomorrow and runs through the weekend, and then next week some. But on Monday night, they'll be honoring Brother Jim with a Lifetime Achievement Award, Brother Jim Dearman. So that's kind of exciting, and I certainly want y'all to be aware of that. I know not everybody gets to go up for the week, but excited about him being honored. And my plan right now is to drive up on Monday and stay through Thursday. So I won't be here next Wednesday night. Freddie will probably take over again and try to get through the next chapter or so of Ecclesiastes. But so look forward to seeing them and look forward to that honor. It will be really good. So thankful for those things. But we're grateful for a chance to study tonight. We're going to jump right in because we're going to try to get through chapters 3 and 4, or the rest of chapter 3. If you were here last week, Freddie jumped in with the beginning, of course, everything has its time, verses 1 through 8. And the section I had kind of given him was through verse 15. He talked about several of those things, so we're not worried about going verse by verse through this study and just trying to catch it as much as we can. But we've continued to talk about this idea, if you have your Bible open there, the theme being from chapter 1 and verse number 2, what profit has a man from all his labor in which he toils under the sun? So we've used that theme, that idea of this thinking about what is under the sun. I appreciate several of you have made comments already about the class. I mentioned as well that I didn't know how this would go. I've never taught it. You know, it seems not too bad, but I think we've all kind of enjoyed it so far with thinking about, our life. And don't waste our life. And that this idea of, what is our life as we think about being Christians every day, especially in a world and even in a country. I mean, the world has lots of issues and problems, but we live in a country that is very blessed. And through those great blessings comes opportunity, comes things we can do, but also comes with a lot of temptation. And that's kind of what we're going to see even a little bit tonight. But last week we talked a little bit about the seasons of life that God is ordering together. There is a time for everything. And so we're going to jump down now tonight and try to cover the end of chapter 3 and chapter 4. Chapter 3 and verse number 16 begins a section where the teacher is going to turn his attention to another topic. You heard me say before that I like to pick on Freddie, of course, and if there's one thing in the world that Freddie Clayton hates more than anything, that is referees. And not just referees, but crooked referees in particular, right? And so as you open up to chapter 3 and verse number 16, what it really is the teacher turns his attention to this idea of justice. He starts considering the idea, and he says in verse 16, in the places of judgment, in the places of where there should be justice, there is not justice. And of course, we give Freddie a hard time, but that's what his thing is. I mean, he doesn't like crooked judges either, by the way, but it's this thing of where there's supposed to be justice, but there is no justice to be found. And this is true. This is a fact of life, whether it's crooked referees, whether it's crooked judges, whether it's crooked cops, people that we place in a level of authority that we believe and assume and trust by authority of the position will have justice, do not always have justice. The places of justice can sometimes be corrupt. The people who are to administer justice can sometimes be wicked, and justice is often not served. So the question that we're kind of thinking about as we think about all these things is, think about how the teacher is saying this almost 3,000 years ago, and the question is, has anything changed? Has life improved at all? The teacher seems to be noticing in the places of judgment, wickedness was there. Verse 16, in the place of righteousness, iniquity was there. If that's what he's saying at that time, and we look around us today and we want things to be right, but they're not, justice is often not served, then we're back to this idea of what is new under the sun? What is life? How difficult life can be. In fact, we said a couple of weeks ago that life is crooked. And tonight we're going to say, in a sense here, life is not right. As we think about these kinds of things, life is crooked and it cannot be fixed no matter who is the king, no matter who we vote for, no matter where we live, no matter how much we try to change these things. Life is crooked, life is not right, And that's difficult for us to think about, but we continue to see that. Justice is not always served. And so tonight we want to think in the beginning here a little bit about this idea of the emptiness of earthly justice. The idea of vanity or emptiness we've used kind of together, meaning the same thing. So the emptiness of early justice. It is very hard for there to ever be absolute, true, full, 100% justice in this world. Think about that again for just a moment. It is very, very difficult, almost impossible for there to be absolute, true, 100% justice in this world. If someone were to kill someone that you loved, right? A loved one of yours were to be murdered, then it may be true that that person who committed that crime might be caught and they might be put in prison. But does that feel like justice? A little bit. The question is, does it bring back your loved one? And it would not. And while you would have this sense of, I'm thankful that justice was served and they're going to go to prison, you don't get your loved one back. The same thing is true, of course, about if they were to go on and be put to death by the state. Does that feel like justice? Maybe in a sense, but no, because there is nothing that can be done to take that evil, that injustice, and to make it right, completely whole again. There's nothing that could ever bring that person back. And so, even on a smaller level, think about our relationships. We're going to talk about relationships again in just a moment from chapter 4. But think about our relationships. When somebody does something to you, maybe they are gossiping about you or they're telling a lie about you or something behind your back and you find out about it, it's really hard to ever be made whole again. In fact, I say a lot of times that we don't ever really forgive and forget. We kind of say we're supposed to, and we kind of say we do, and we think about God doing that. But for most of us, we can forgive, and we can move on as if it never happened a little bit. But depending on the severity of the trouble, how bad it was, how ugly it was, we have a hard time just really turning it off and saying, oh, I don't remember that. Because we remember. And sometimes that's a healthy mechanism for us to keep, balance in relationships and distance. But we are supposed to forgive. And to a sense, we are to try to forget. But there is not full justice. In fact, look at chapter 4 and verse number 1, kind of grouping these together a little differently. Again, not going verse by verse. Verse 1 of chapter 4 says, "Then I returned and considered all the oppression that is done under the sun, and look, the tears of the oppressed, but they have no comforter. On the side of their oppressors there is power, but they have no comforter." The teacher sees the tears of the oppressed. There's no one to comfort them. Power, we might say, is on the side of the oppressors. And sometimes there's nothing that the righteous or the innocent can do. It's just a terrible way of the world. From the time that mankind sort of started exerting their own power and will. I'm going to do what I want to do. I'm in control, so I'll judge and rule how I want to. From that time on, people can struggle with this. Keep reading there in chapter 4, verses 2 and 3. "Therefore I praise the dead who are already dead, more than the living who are still alive, yet better than both is he who has never existed, who has not seen the evil work that is done under the sun." The teacher's point here, which is kind of hard for us to swallow, is it's better to have never been born than to be alive and see the wickedness that is done in the world. I've used this illustration multiple times already, and it's just going to kind of keep being something that I think about. But when we are able to know just how messed up the world is, it can be really discouraging, and it can be really difficult to handle. And that is one of the even inadvertent drawbacks of social media. I've said that, we can get on there and we can see people we need to pray for, and that's encouraging, and people who are dealing with something get on and they can say, oh, I'm so thankful that I could tell Christians around the world and friends all across the Southeast to pray for my family or this situation. But sometimes those of us sometimes it's called doom scrolling, right? Just constantly flipping through social media, and we're reminded about every car accident and every hurricane and every tornado and every bit of cancer and every child that's died and every bit of sexual abuse that's happened and all these things. And you know what? I don't think our minds are able to handle that. I don't think we were meant to handle that. We know there's injustice in the world. We know there is difficulty, but it really sort of wears us down when we know there's no comfort from any of that. And that's kind of the idea here of getting caught up in earthly justice can be quite a very difficult thing. trying to get caught up in it, seeing that it's through, seeing it to the finish, that everything is justified and done with, because there is an emptiness to it. That's why, and going back to chapter 3 and verse number 17, the teacher goes on and turns his attention to God. So what's the point here? He says in verse 17, then, I said in my heart, God shall judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time there for every purpose and for every work. What's the point? The point is that we can have hope in God. Verse number 17 tells us that we need to hope in God. God is the one to deal with all of these circumstances. You and I can't. We don't have the omniscience. We don't have the power. We don't have all that we need to take care of these things. And so notice again, the teacher is talking about life without God. He keeps talking about life is meaningless. It's not just meaningless, it's meaningless apart from God. When we have hope in God, only God will judge the righteous and the wicked. And in verse 17, the teacher says there is an appointed time for every matter and for every work to be judged. Life is not right. Life is not fair. And we are not wrong to say this. But what we need to understand is there is coming a day of judgment. In fact, we don't have time tonight to list all the New Testament passages. You know some of them about the fact that we will all stand before the judgment seat of Christ. But in 1 John chapter 4 and verse 17, 1 John 4 and verse 17, John says that we're able to have boldness in the day of judgment. What does that mean? What is that talking about? Yeah, absolutely. We have confidence. We know that we have eternal life, and we know that God will make all these matters right. He is righteous. He is just. He will take care of those things. And we get caught up in trying to be the administrator of justice, and we realize a lot of times it's very difficult because we have bias. We have things in our life that we would look over if it were this person, or we would do different if it were that person. And we're not the perfect administrator of those things. What's the point of the emptiness of earthly justice? Well, the point is that we need to have hope in God. And so the question comes up then over and over again, why doesn't God do something about it now? You know what he's talking about here? This is something that's a big deal. In fact, it's called the problem of evil, pain, and suffering. Why doesn't God do something about all the injustice now? If God is just, then he needs to do something. And so the unbeliever says there must not be a God because of all these things that happen, because of the wickedness. This is a screenshot here of the webpage, or part of the webpage. It's called evilpainandsuffering.com. That is actually owned by World Video Bible School. I mean, this is their website, so they own that URL there and the web address. And they have a lot of their resources that you can find on YouTube, or you can find on the World Video Bible School webpage. All these places kind of in one slot there. And sometimes people don't even know this is what they're struggling with, but this is what they're struggling with. When they are struggling with doubt and unbelief, they're struggling with this sense of justice. And so people kind of ask this question. Now, as the notes that I've been using says, it shouldn't cause unbelief. In fact, the writer here says, I would point out that you believing that there needs to be justice and equity proves that there is a God because of that, right? But what is the answer that the teacher gives to this problem? Why doesn't God do something now to make the world right? Why doesn't God give constant and consistent justice now? What is God doing? That's what people are struggling with. And so we move on to verse number 18, and the teacher says that God allows the world to be crooked in this way to teach us something. God is showing us something by allowing the emptiness of justice and the lack of comfort among those things. God is showing this idea of dust to dust, as he says here. He's saying, look at verses 19 and 20, that we are all like animals. God is teaching us that the outcome for animals and humans are the same. Doesn't make you feel warm and fuzzy inside. It doesn't make you feel good, but it's true. God is teaching us that we all go to one place. Look at verse number 20. And what's interesting is as you look at this section of Scripture, you'll notice here in verse 20 the idea of dust to dust. You'll notice in a moment when we get over to chapter 4 some other phrases or some other verses that you know well, but it helps you to put them in context. All come from the dust, and to the dust all must return. We think about this promise from God, this statement that God made in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 19. in the curse of sin. You're taken from the ground, and to the ground you will return. And so we look around us and we see that we're like not unlike a lot of other things in this world that are running down, that are, fading away, that are molding and getting older and falling apart, and even like animals. There is the fact that we are all going to die. And so when we think about this, a lot of people get caught up in life with these kinds of things. In fact, when he makes this point here at the end, notice in verse number 21, a very interesting statement or question here. He says, "Who knows the spirit of the sons of men, which goes upward, and the spirit of the animal, which goes down to the earth?" The teacher notes here, we can't see our outcome, like physically. When somebody dies or an animal dies, we can't stand here and physically know what happened to the person. You don't know by using your senses, by observation, if the death of the human is the same as the death of an animal is, or if something different happens, unless we start talking about the faith that we should have. You either have faith that there is an eternity and your spirit goes upward, so to speak, or you have faith that there is not an eternity and your spirit goes to the ground, and I guess that's it. We're just like dust. We're just like Rover. We're dead all over, right? That's what you say. So when we think about this idea of these observations and what God is wanting us to learn, if God is teaching us that there is no avoiding our appointed time of death and justice, then what are we supposed to learn? What are we supposed to do? A couple things here real quick, and then we'll take some comments or questions. But if this is kind of the, again, depressing, I know it may not be the best word to use here, but kind of the discouraging thought of, well, we're all just going back to dust, we're just like the animals, what are we supposed to do? What does God want us to learn from this? The message that we can take from this is something that's become a popular quote over the years, and there's really no serious attribution to it of where it came from. It's not attributed to any one person. It's been a part of a book from 2021, or 2021, by a CEO of a lot of sports teams. But this phrase, "be where your feet are." Be where your feet are. The interesting thing I think about this section of Scripture is this dust to dust, we can't know, life is meaningless, all this. Go back and look at verse 22. "So I perceive that nothing is better than that a man should rejoice in his own works, for that is his heritage. For who can bring him to see what will happen after him?" The teacher draws the conclusion here that in a sense we need to live life with enjoyment from day to day. We need to live life with mortality in view. We spend so much time looking to something else that we neglect to look at the right now. That's what that phrase is. That's what that picture was I had up there. Be where your feet are. I even saw it this week on a social media tweet from a college football team, encouraging people, be where your feet are. Don't be somewhere else. Don't be worried about the other time, but be where you are in the moment. And that's kind of the anti of what we think Ecclesiastes is saying. That seems to be kind of the anti of what Scripture might be saying. But when we think about it in this context, and even in James chapter 4, verses 13 through 17, you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you're just like a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away. The teacher draws the conclusion that we need to live life with enjoyment for the day because we don't know what's going to happen next. You do not know what will happen once you are dead. You don't know what's going to happen the next day or later today. We want to live our lives with these plans, believing that we have the power to carry out every single thing that we have. But the truth is, life is crooked. Life is not right. There are young people, probably even unfortunately this week, who pass away from various things, car accidents or even tragically flash flooding in our area. And so we don't need to live only for today and that we throw caution to the wind and we live it up and engage in every sin that we can, but we need to understand that God has given us right now. We need to be thankful for the moment. And when we can do that, then life is not meaningless. If we're granted by God, by the Lord, to gather with our friends and family, and today or tomorrow or in the time of holidays that will be coming up, God be willing by the end of the year, we don't know what's going to happen. And so we can take advantage of what we have, not in a sinful way, but in a way of making the most of it. We often ask the question, what would you do differently if you knew today was the last day? If you knew you didn't have tomorrow, we would probably do something a little different. So go then and live life in that way, taking advantage of the blessings God has given you. Live life with mortality in view. Not in a carefree way, also not, as we're going to talk in just a moment, in a balanced way, not in a just down in the drudges. Well, that's, there's nothing I can do about it. And I think most of you understand that balance there. So that's a lot, but what comments or questions we got here to jump in?
I think that the idea of, just like animals, maybe it's implied that should humble us a tad, realizing that there is a part of us that is going to go to the grave, and outside of our spirit and the eternal abode and faithful and all, then we're like animals. And in another sense, if God always made justice happen immediately when it was deserved of being applied, then a bunch of us wouldn't even be here.
Yeah, absolutely.
We'd have been struck dead a long time ago.
We should be thankful for God's justice. I mean, I think that's the message. We've tried to say that, but we also need to be thankful for God's patience and then be able to enjoy that. Sue?
I have a quote I like. Probably came from a Latin class. Don't wait for life to get better. Life is always complicated. Learn to be happy now, or you'll run out of time.
Yeah, very good. We'll run out of time if we don't learn to be happy now.
I had a thought on that, the idea of justice. And, when we're kids, I was always taught play fair. And, but as I started getting along, I noticed that everybody didn't do it. Everybody didn't think that.
Everybody else didn't think it was fair. Yeah, what was fair was fair.
And so after a while, I kind of come to the conclusion, well, how's this going to work? I mean, if they're going to beat me every time because they don't play fair, then I got to do what they do.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
Yeah.
That's the problem even as adults.
Sure.
Because Jesus taught us not to be that.
Yeah.
Everything he did indicated to us, you do not render evil for evil. And so that's what we have to keep in mind, I think. And also, I was looking here, Thessalonians chapter 5, 1 Thessalonians, it says, see that none render evil for evil unto any man, but ever follow that which is good, both among yourselves and to all men. And then he says, rejoice evermore.
Yeah.
There's the joy.
Yeah.
We're supposed to be joyful in our lives, and I think if we actually do that and try to be fair and good, not only to ourselves but everybody else, regardless of what they do, then I think we can have joy.
Yeah.
Well, you can pull your head at night, I don't mind getting beat, but I don't want to get beat by somebody cheating. And if I refuse to cheat to win, then I can be confident when I go to sleep and feel good about myself. If a person has to cheat to win, I hope they're miserable the rest of their life.
It's true. I mean, those are all great statements. It's absolutely true. It's sometimes very difficult for us to think of in the moment as these things are going on. And even as we're kind of saying here, these illustrations, there's a difference between, as Ricky and Freddie are kind of saying, losing at a game of checkers, or football in the backyard. And as we use as an illustration, somebody, walking up and shooting your loved one and taking their life. But at the same time, there's a bottom line principle that we think, and Ricky points out from the New Testament, 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, here in Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and 4, though that God wants us, we don't live under the old covenant, under the new covenant, but the law of Christ, but that God wants us and his people in kind of overarching way to be people that try to understand this. And as Ricky was saying that, that's what we teach, we struggle to teach that with our kids. We don't want our kids to suffer, but hopefully there's some benefit in that. And some parents, learn that, you can't get involved in every single thing. Sometimes if you step in and try to administer justice, they've got to figure out, and they've got to learn those hard lessons that life's not fair. Some of these ecclesiastical lessons at the age of 5 or 6 or 4, whatever, that life is not fair, that you've got to take care of what you can, Romans chapter 12 is one of my favorite ones. As much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. Kind of back to Freddie's point, I'm going to do all I can every day to act fair and balanced and just in what I do, and I can go to bed at night. I might have lost money. Somebody might have, run their mouth. I mean, I don't know in this gamut of situations, but I can go to sleep knowing that I've done my best to be fair and right in it, and know that I serve the just God, who, maybe that person eventually comes to faith and obedience to Christ. Maybe they don't. But that's kind of the way life goes. And man, there's some tough lessons there for sure. What else here, very quickly? Robert?
Well, people ask why is God doing something about the problems right now? Well, He is. As a Christian, He's trying our faith. We've got to be faithful. We've got to be faithful. And grow as we ought to grow. So God's giving us that chance.
Yeah, absolutely.
And knowing that people are always watching your response, especially as a Christian, some people waiting for you to misstep, but if you handle those situations with grace when you don't want to, because it's not fair, then people are watching that.
Yeah.
So being that example.
For sure. Set a great example. We talk about, a little bit on our example on Sunday and other lessons. I mean, the example we have to set for others, you never know when somebody's watching, and it may not be, we've got to get back to the Bible. We've got to sit down and study the Bible with someone and teach them what it means to be a Christian, but it's not always the Bible study that teaches the lesson that might, convince somebody to come and visit or to think about biblical things. You just never know for sure. So let's quickly try to get into chapter 4 just a little bit here. As we've mentioned already, the book of Ecclesiastes is often misunderstood to say that everything is meaningless. We've kind of already mentioned that in our notes already here tonight. That is, so why worry? Why do anything? It's just simply meaningless. But chapter 4 is going to explain to us, in kind of this contrast to the way we've been speaking of these things, that there are some things that absolutely matter. And here's the problem. Here's the issue, though. We forfeit these things sometimes for the things in life that don't matter to anything, that don't amount to anything. And that's what really chapter 4, we've already talked about the first 3 verses, but if you have a Bible there, we're going to try to look at through verse 16 here, the rest of the chapter. But verses 4 through 16 are going to help us learn about some things that we sometimes put in place of things that really matter. Of course, what really ultimately matters is our service to God, being faithful to Him, becoming a Christian, and some of those things. We'll forfeit those things for the things that are futile, the things that don't matter, the things that are running down and won't be there any longer. So let's notice then, beginning in verses 4 through 6, some foolish motivations. The teacher begins by noting one of the wrong reasons to work hard. He says in verse 4, "Again I saw that for all toil and every skillful work, a man is envied by his neighbor. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind." The problem is, people want to try to keep up with the Joneses, as we say. The foolish motivations that cause us to get up every day, to go through our day, to go to work extra, or to make more money sometimes, is that we are trying to keep up with the Joneses. We think we should be able to have what they have. I use the New King James. The New King James says in verse 4, a man is envied by his neighbor. And so the problem here is that we often work hard because we want more. We work extra hours just to have more money or more stuff, or we will, convince ourselves into thinking that working extra hard and long hours is good because we're providing for our families. But the truth is, if we're being honest, we would admit that maybe we've already provided for, and we're working extra just to have more stuff, and we're trying to keep up with the Joneses. But notice in verse 5, he moves to the other side of the coin. He says in verse number 5, "The fool folds his hands and consumes his own flesh." Some people wisely look at all of our labor and toil and all that work, and they think it's foolish. But then they go to the other extreme, and their extreme is it's meaningless. It's pointless, and so I'm just not going to do anything. I'll fold my hands together and I'll rest, and I'm not going to work. I'm not going to do anything. And notice what he says here. If you do not work, the idiom that's used there in verse 5, he eats his own flesh. You remember 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 and verse 10. If anyone is not willing to work, let him not eat. You know, God's great motivation to make us work is it makes us hungry, right? And so we think about this idea both in the Old Testament and the New Testament. And so you see kind of, I know it's a little small here, but these extremes, this idea again of some people are working hard to have the most and some people are not working at all. And I don't know if that green line's exactly in the middle. It looks pretty close from here on the back TV. But you get the point. We're trying to find the right balance. I mean, it may be time that we take on extra hours. There may be time that we can make a little more money and do a little bit more, but not to the neglect of our family. And so what we notice here is there are two foolish extremes, working so hard because you're just trying to accumulate and not working at all. And notice what he says in verse number 6, the proper perspective. Better a handful with quietness than both hands full together with toil and grasping for the wind. So what's better? Well, it's better to have one handful with rest and quietness than to have two handfuls of labor and effort as you're chasing after the wind. The same concept that we've been talking about, that he's been mentioning time after time again. Don't stop working, but stop working so much in a sense. Work enough that you can have quietness and tranquility. Work enough to be able to enjoy rest. Don't run around and you can, imagine the silliness I'm kind of showing here, but with your hands full, chasing after the wind. That's the way some people are living their life and they're living their work life. And as, I don't know, we've said here, a few people have already stated tonight, time is fleeting. We never know that we're promised tomorrow, and we certainly need to provide for our own, right? The one who will not provide for his own. The New Testament is called an infidel, an unbeliever, and so we need to work and provide, but try to find, back to that previous slide, the balance of those things. And so the teacher is going to show us why this balance of having one hand of quietness is so important. And so then let's go on to verse number 7 here. He says, Then I returned and I saw vanity under the sun. There's one alone without companion. He has neither son nor brother, yet there is no end to all his labors, nor is his eye satisfied with riches. But he never asks, For whom do I toil and deprive myself of good? This also is vanity and a grave misfortune. Again, that's the New King James I have in front of me here. But the teacher begins in this section of talking about valuing relationships. Not the foolish motivations, but valuing relationships. He begins by describing a person who has no one else in his life. He's all alone. You'll notice that from the text there, this person works and works, but he has no one in life to enjoy these things with. So the question comes up, what is the point? What is the point of having money and possessions if you do not have to share it with anyone, if you do not have anyone to share it with? What is the point of having anything if you do not have friends or family or relationships with whom you can share? Notice the teacher's not saying that the single life is bad, right? Nobody's saying you can't be single, but he's showing us that relationships are more important than the wealth. And when we think about that, we think about the fact that God made us as relational human beings. We need each other. We need relationships. We see that in the very beginning in the garden. The cow's not good enough. The bird's not good enough for Adam. He needs someone. He needs that relationship. And so we need people in our lives. We like to pretend that we're self-sufficient sometimes. We like to pretend that we don't need anyone. But what is the point of all your labor and all your efforts if you have no one to enjoy the fruit of your labor? How many songs have been written, right? Freddie was joking about the birds last week, and we think about the cats in the cradle and all those things. How many songs have been written about people who have looked back? How many movies have been made about people that look back? And the thing is, they're not physically alone, always. They're not physically alone. There's somebody else in the house. There's a woman that maybe for a man that, a woman who was in the same bed night after night, but, with this much space between them that felt like this much space, because there was no bonding or connection. There was no good relationship there. There are kids in the house. And look, I can't tell you what to do with your life or your work or all these things, but I do want to challenge you just to think about it. We all have to figure out for ourselves what that balance is and what our work requires of us and make enough money to provide for our own. But I hate reading to you and giving you big, long quotes, but in the notes I'm using, there was kind of like a whole paragraph here. I tried to break it down where it'll be a little smaller. You can read it. I'll read it aloud in case you can't see and you can follow along, but I just thought this kind of sums up everything we're trying to say here. Friends, this is a really big warning that God is making to us. What is the point of losing your family because you decided to work a couple extra hours? What is the purpose of losing relationships with friends and family because you spend so much time at work? Now we think we are not forfeiting our relationships when we are striving with two hands for the wind, but you're not home because you're at work. You're not at worship. Oh, let's take it a little further, right? We're not just talking about being home at 5 o'clock for supper. You're not at worship and Bible studies because you're at work. Then you wonder why you do not have anyone in your life. We are showing people what is more important than when we spend our time at work. Yes, we have to work, but do we need to work as much as we think? Are we deceiving ourselves into thinking that we need to put in all this time at work, that we are so needed and so important to work that we have to do it? The teacher says in the meantime from Ecclesiastes here, you are destroying your relationships. You're not going to have a family who cares about you because you have shown that you do not care about them. You're not going to have friendships because you have shown that you do not care about others. You care about money. You care about work. You think you are important. How many of us have quit work thinking, maybe even hoping, that your work is just going to collapse without you because you are so important? Did it happen? A lot of us can say, no, it didn't. Maybe things at work were not as smooth because you were not there, but you are just a replaceable cog in the wheel. You are not important at work, but you are important when it comes to relationships. But we place our families on the altar to work a little more. There's a lot there. There's a lot to unpack, and a lot of us have been guilty of this at a time, and maybe we were able to see through it and change or to try to get some of those relationships back. But I just kind of thought that summed up a lot of what we are having to say here. And there's preacher after preacher who can give stories of members of their congregation who got to the end of their life and they died, and maybe nobody showed up to the funeral. Or maybe a few people showed up and they just kind of talked about how terrible of a person they were, which is kind of uncomfortable to think about, but I mean, it's just true sometimes. And so when we think about our decisions, when we think about our life, we've got to think about these relationships and valuing these relationships. The question is here, who is going to be there for you when you fall if you destroy your relationships? Because you're going to fall. And it may not be that you fall into sin, but you're going to need help. You're going to get a cancer diagnosis. You might lose your job. You might have a family member that's having trouble. You're going to fall in some way. And then again, you might fall into sin. You might fall into struggles and temptation and doing things that you shouldn't be doing. Now, who are you going to turn to? If you spend so much time thinking about all these other things and grasping after the wind, destroying your relationships, who's going to be there? Now, here's some verses Pick up in verse number 9 there real quick. We still got a few minutes left. I'll try to get through my notes here and we can take some comments or questions. But verse 9, you know this, right? 2 are better than 1 because they have a good reward for their labor. You've heard that. Look at verse 10. And here it is in verse 10. For if they fall, one will lift up his companion, but woe to him who is alone when he falls, for he has no one to help him up. And 11 and 12. Again, if 2 lie down together and they keep warm, how can one keep warm alone? Verse 12, a 3-fold cord is not quickly broken. You know those things. We use them in talking about friendships and relationships. Here's the context. The context is in valuing relationships and the importance of those things that the writer of Ecclesiastes is trying to get us to understand. Verse 10 says, pity the person who falls without another person to lift them up. And in fact, moving on very quickly here to the very end, in verses 13 through 16, he basically says that wisdom without wealth is greater than wealth without wisdom. Notice verse 13, better a poor and wise youth. We don't really agree with that. Nobody wants to be poor. Better a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who will be admonished no more. For when he comes out of prison to be king, although he was born poor in his kingdom, I saw all the living who walk under the sun. They were with the second youth who stands in his place. Because you know what? As Freddie said a moment ago, he dies. He moves on. He's gone. And somebody has to take over the kingdom. There was no end of all the people over whom he was made king. Yet those who come afterward will not rejoice in him. Surely this also is vanity and grasping for the wind. My Bible has a heading here in this section, an uninspired heading, that says popularity also passes away. This king was the king. People bow down to him, but he's gone. And, he might get his name on the castle. He might get his name on a building. But there are going to be people who come after who don't remember him the same way that others do. And so the chapter ends with a call to wisdom. Better to be poor and wise than to be old, rich, and foolish. Wisdom without wealth, to be poor, but to have wisdom is better, greater than to have all that money, but to be just an old, rich fool. Again, New Testament kind of bears that out, right? We think about those who are in that position. There is no end of the people who come before you. We can't count them. We could try, but it's hard to count them. There is no end of people who will come after you. So, we need to understand that and handle it with wisdom. So the challenge here at the end of the notes I've been using is, what are you doing to destroy relationships in the name of work and wealth? What is your motivation for working hard and building wealth? Are you trying to keep up with everyone else? Are you trying to fill the hole that is in your life? Are you trying to make much of yourself, acting like you're important? Or are you going to think about your family? Think about the things that matter. Think about not sacrificing relationships on the altar of success or achievement or pride or wealth. It's better to have one hand full with people in your life than to have two hands full of wind.
I'm just trying to be able to afford Becky's vacations to Europe.
Look at that. We're out of time for the night. Okay. Time to go. No. I know Brian's being facetious, but that's the balance. We're all trying to, he said, no, he's not. We're all trying to strike that balance of, look, our kids are asking us when we're going to go to the beach again. There's nothing wrong with a vacation and doing those things and living life. I already told you a minute ago, enjoy the moment, right? Live life, enjoy the moment. But you begin to see this balance of all those things. And as I said a few moments ago, I can't answer it for you. I cannot make it for you and say, you worked 41 hours this week. That's 1 hour too many. Shame on you. I can't tell you that. I don't know your job. I don't know your situation. I don't know if you're trying to finance, a vacation every month or if you're just trying to finance one vacation. All I'm trying to tell you is what I think God is trying to tell us, which is that each one of us has to make decisions for ourselves and try to keep in mind that life is often like chasing after the wind. And understanding that we can enjoy the moment and be grateful for what we have. Be where your feet are. Take advantage of what's in front of you. Now, stop worrying about everything else. And at the same time, we just have to try to balance all that. I don't know.
I think it's about having your priorities in the right place. Obviously, some have more than others, and it has nothing to do with that. It has to do with where your heart is.
Yeah.
And you can't have these other idols in life to be in opposition to your spiritual life with God. You can't seek for riches. You can't seek for fame or pleasure all the time.
Yeah.
At the detriment of all these other things. There are some things more important than others.
Yeah. Most of us, I think Ricky's right on it here, keeping our priorities right. When we do that, we keep God in the first place, and we care for our family. Typically, things tend to kind of fall in line. You may not get to go on vacation every month of the year, 12 times a year, but you probably find your way into one of some sort, You may not have, the fanciest car, but chances are you got a car to get around, and get you where you need to be, and those basic necessities are met. And certainly, as they were both saying together here, not to the detriment of other things. And so often we're chasing after having enough. And look, we talked about this. We spent a whole quarter on this the first of the year with the Kyle Butt material, with the stewardship material. How much is enough? That if you think, I'll just work the overtime this month or this quarter, and I'll make enough to do that, and then, you get to the next quarter and something else breaks or something else is needed. And guess what? You're doing it again, and you're doing it again.
Every situation's different, so that's why it's good to keep your relationship, if you're talking about in a family.
Yeah.
Talk about those things and see what's going to work best for your family and what you should do.
Then maybe even talk about that before you say I do. Make sure that who you're saying I do to is on the same page with you.
Yeah.
Ephesians 4:28 says, "Let him who stole still no longer, rather let him labor, working with his hands what is good, that he may have something to
Yeah.
The whole purpose of work is not how many toys I can have. The motivation is supposed to be to work, to give to those that obviously
Yeah.
I have a need, my family has a need, but my fellow man has a need. And I've never worked for my fellow man, that'd be hard to do, but that's the whole entire purpose
Yeah.
of work.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's a good point. All right, Brian redeemed himself. We're going to stop there. All right, we're good to go. We'll pick up with chapter 5, then hopefully next week Freddie will. I'll be gone, but appreciate your comments and